for scheduling this panel discussion. Also, many thanks to all the participants for joining. I believe we had over 150 individuals register for the event. So that demonstrates the level of interest in the topic and outstanding job MOBI team is doing and communicate what we're doing, right? So just to kick off, I have laid out 3 objectives for today's panel discussion. So number 1, from a very high level, introduce the concept of next generation vehicle identity beyond the famous VIN number and why the industry needs it. The panel will discuss value propositions, use cases, new business ideas. Then we'll take a deeper dive in under the hood of how this new VID works, reference architecture that MOBI has drafted. We'll talk about DID, SSI, verifiable credentials, vehicle birth certificates. Finally, we'll talk about implementation challenges for the industry to adopt this new VID. So having said that, allow me to introduce today's panel. As Annabelle mentioned, they are both Alan and Johannes Klepsch are the co-chairs of the working group. Johannes Klepsch is a product owner for emerging technology at BMW Group based in Munich. In his role, he advises BMW departments for the adoption of blockchain use cases and drives collaboration with stakeholders in the mobility ecosystem. He holds a PhD in mathematics from Technical University Munich. Our second panelist is Alan Gordon. He's a technical leader in advanced computer and AI at Ford in Palo Alto, California. He has worked in the software industry for 23 years in a wide variety of domains, including active noise control, medical devices, navigation, LBS services for smartphones. He's also written 2 books on software development. And this is a fun fact about him. He started his blockchain journey in 2016 using Bitcoin to buy fake IDs to use as test data. And another fact is he's banned from certain crypto exchanges we hear. Can't say the name. Our third panelist, he's not a co-chair, but he helped draft most of the reference architecture. He's Johannes Siedelmeier. He's a research assistant at FIM Research Center in Germany, University of Beirut. In his research, he focuses on performance measurements for permission blockchains, energy consumption of public and private blockchains, decentralized DID management, SSI, compliant use of blockchains, and capabilities of zero-knowledge proofs for improving scalability, privacy of blockchain-based architectures. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, panel, for joining this morning or this afternoon in Germany. So let me start with by painting a big picture, and I'll start with Alan and Johannes Klepsch. Describe what is this new vehicle identity and why is it different than VIN and why the industry needs it. Alan, you want to go first?
Sure. In terms of a VIN, right? A VIN works well for the physical world, right? So you can walk up to a car, you can look at the windshield, or if you take it into the dealer, they look at the door jamb there, and you can see what the identity is of that vehicle. And it's something that's affixed when the car is created. The problem with the VIN is it's good for the physical world. It's not as good for the digital world, right? Ultimately, what you need in the digital world is for a vehicle to be able to prove its identity to someone else, right? And to do it cryptographically, right? And to do it in a way that's tamper-proof, right? So to some extent, that was sort of the starting point, right? When we started on this effort, is how do you assign an identity to a vehicle that is appropriate for the digital world, right? And not just for the digital world. When you think about it, in the world that we're sort of moving towards, there's more and more commerce happening at the edge, right? There's more and more things when you talk about autonomy and V to X, right? Vehicles talking to each other and vehicles talking to infrastructure in real time, there's actually a need to be able to do these identity verifications quickly, right? So that was our starting point. And fairly early on in the effort, we had a lot of really smart people, a lot of people who've been involved in the blockchain and DLT space for a long time, who let us know that there's a lot of work at the W3C going on this already, that we don't want to go about inventing any new wheels, right? So that's why we sort of focused on creating something that was compatible with that, right? So essentially the vehicle identity is a DID, right? Or that's what we expect to be the usual implementation of it, that then at birth references a DID document, or a certificate, I should say, called the vehicle birth certificate, right? And that vehicle birth certificate is going to contain the VIN, right? So it's backwardly compatible, but it also is going to include some other information that allows you to identify the vehicle that is called out in the VID1 standard, right? What those full set of fields are.
Yeah. Johannes Kleps, you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. Let me actually try to kind of paint an even broader picture than what Alan did, in the sense that I think we are all on the same page when I say that mobility is changing dramatically, right? And this has been the pitch that actually MOBI was also presenting. And I'm kind of quoting Tim Ballinger here, the CEO of MOBI, when he said that the vehicle was once viewed as a symbol for independence, and that picture has kind of changed over the years, right? I think many of you can relate when I say that, yeah, it's become kind of a symbol for frustration in many cities of the world, right? And I think luckily we live in a world where technology is at a state where it might kind of help out here a little bit. And I think in February 2019, I had this slide in one of the decks at one of the colloquiums that basically pitched the confluence of IoT in order for things and entities to be able to communicate, AI for in order to handle the data that is being created in these communication processes, and then last but not least, blockchain in order to provide this trust layer underneath that communication that is then used to make sure that every entity in the end has an identity, is intelligent, and can then transact with other entities. And this is in the end what we try to do through that DID standard, right? Is to give vehicles that digital identity that Alan was talking about. And in doing that, well, what we hope to do is to provide one of the key components for an open ecosystem for broad and efficient communication and collaboration.
Yeah, thanks. So Johannes Sielmar, Alan mentioned slightly briefly about the vehicle birth certificate and what it includes in terms of data structure. So can you give us an insight of what this VID looks like in terms of data structure and how it'll be created and where it will be created?
Sure. I mean, from the real world analogy, so the vehicle birth certificate of a car somehow corresponds to, for example, my birth certificate or my ID card. So it contains attributes that the vehicle has and probably also keeps over its lifetime, or at least they should rarely change, and that somehow allow the car, or in general a vehicle, to verifiably claim that it has certain attributes. So when the vehicle is being manufactured, the manufacturer could digitally sign a document. This is the vehicle birth certificate that states, okay, so the car has a certain color, the car has a certain engine number, it has a certain fuel type, and it might contain in the end 20 or 30 attributes of the car that make it identifiable, and that will be important also for processes later on, where the car needs to demonstrate some properties that it has, for example, when it wants to register. We will talk about the use cases a bit in a minute, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's really the analog to my physical ID card in the digital world. The car can use it in order to demonstrate that it has certain attributes, and it can prove this by saying it was the manufacturer that all of we know and that we trust that actually signed this vehicle birth certificate. And therefore, it's an instantiation of so-called verifiable credentials, which are being standardized by the W3C. And that's basically just a digital verifiable document that is signed by some institution that we trust. And so we can check whether the claims that we have, that we make, are actually true or not.
Yeah, and you mentioned 20-something data attributes, and we have those attributes in the MOBI standard. But my question is, those attributes are sort of dynamic, right? As the vehicle goes through different process of ownership, some of those data attributes change. Okay. All right. So
yeah, sure. I mean,
yeah,
it makes sense to separate it a bit. So if I already know at the birth of the vehicle that this attribute will certainly change, then maybe it's a good idea to split off this attribute and to make this another credential that is also more dynamic. So for example, the color of a car, typically it doesn't change. So it makes sense to include it in the vehicle birth certificate because it allows me later on to get somehow it's somehow like the biometry of a car that can be used to bind the digital credential to the physical car. And so I can check whether those things fit together or not. For things that are highly dynamic, I think we will also talk later about this. For example, a maintenance record where I track somehow all the repairs that a car has went through. And if parts are replaced there, then it's probably more suitable to just give the car yet another credential than to update the vehicle birth certificate, because this includes a lot of other attributes that are not touched typically.
Yeah. Yeah, Johannes Kleps, you mentioned root of trust and blockchain. So a natural question here for the audience would be, what is the role of blockchain, DLT, and wallets
that's
for this?
It's a very relevant question, and I think it's like the root of a lot of confusion that is actually out there and out there in the space. And like I really want to emphasize that point, right? Because I think it's fundamental to understand that blockchain or DLT or whatever definitely does not, and I emphasize that, does not serve as a storage for vehicle data, right? This is like super relevant. And like I think to us, and I think Johannes Edelmeier is in a much better position to make that point super concise, but to us, it really only serves as sort of a governing function to, to orchestrate accesses to the information through, say, read or write permissions. And if you will, you can compare it to a key infrastructure that is basically decentralized through those blockchain nodes, right?
Yeah.
And through that key infrastructure, you can then enable the verification of verifiable credentials and so on. But yeah, let me repeat what I said at the very beginning. There is no vehicle data stored on chain in a DoD kind of setup.
Alan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, and I agree. And the thing about it is, I think the thinking regarding that has evolved, right? And especially as it relates to GDPR, right? And sort of what things can be stored on a blockchain, and whether even like hashes of data can be stored on a blockchain. And Johannes is exactly right, right? To some extent, we're using it a little bit as sort of a decentralized key and permissions infrastructure, right? The most important things are the credentials, right? And the way that people can go about sort of prove it, I shouldn't say people, vehicles, right? In our particular case, can go about proving things about themselves, right? In a decentralized world, right? These are things that, to some extent you can do now in a centralized infrastructure and using third parties, right? The question is how do you do that in a world that's decentralized, that's autonomous, right? That's moving at machine to machine speed instead of with a human in the loop. And I think that's where, DLTs in general, right? And blockchains can provide value in this world.
Yeah, so let me give an opportunity for Johannes Edelmeier to chime in, since you want to talk about the role of DLT blockchain in this and in a more technical way.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, I can only also emphasize what Johannes and Alan said. So strictly speaking, we don't need blockchain in order to achieve technically a vehicle identity. So the central role are verifiable credentials. They are basically signed documents that are cryptographically signed by institutions that we trust, like a car manufacturer or a government authority. And so the integrity and the validity of these credentials can be checked by verifying the signature. So this is basically also known as public key infrastructure. Nevertheless, blockchains can help to make a few tasks more convenient. So you can somehow compare the role of blockchain in such a PKI to a public telephone book. So how would you know what the signing key of, for example, BMW or Ford or some government authority would be? So today, this is often the task of certificate authorities. And blockchain might be one way to make this whole system a bit more democratic and also more reliable. Another thing is, where do we make publicly available the standards that we use? So for example, in order to have a useful vehicle birth certificate, we somehow want to agree on the attributes that are included in the vehicle birth certificate. And a blockchain is a nice way of making a versioned history of this agreed on standard available to everyone. And thirdly, one big issue is revocation. So sometimes credentials need to be revoked before they expire because, for example, a vehicle has been stolen. And today, revocation in the internet is always a bit tricky because there are a lot of stakeholders. And so, of course, I trust the one that issues the credential, like the manufacturer. So the manufacturer could have their own registry of revocations, and you can just have an API call to retrieve it. But first, the respective entity would always learn when you do such a query, which is not ideal for privacy. And second, they need to maintain a quite secure way of handling all this data. And a blockchain makes it very convenient as a common infrastructure on which all parties can agree on and where they don't need to set up a new system to do the tasks that are necessary to maintain the revocations.
Yeah, good point. So I'm gonna do a bit of a left turn here. I'm going to talk about the use cases that the working group, the vehicle identity working group at MOBI is looking at. So Johannes Klepsch, you want to go first and tell us about the various use cases and the recent most used case that we've been talking about, which is the battery certificate.
Sure, yeah. So basically, I mean, we started a year, 1.5 years ago with a second stage of the vehicle ID working group. And what we started off doing with the working group was to collect all sorts of different use cases that might occur in the vehicle lifetime, right? And then the next step was to cluster them in different buckets in order to come up with concise requirements with respect to vehicle identity. And in the end, what we came up with was basically a reference architecture for a process flow for digitized versions of use cases that are then based on an SSI or DLT approach, right? And the main idea behind these use cases are basically trusted digital documents, right? And the two use cases that we then focused on in the last version of the standard that were prioritized by the working group were first to enable a fully digital registration process, right? To basically, especially in Corona times, I think this is highly relevant, right? To make sure that basically in the registration process you wouldn't necessarily need any kind of human interaction. And the second one, the second use case that we then focused on was, as briefly mentioned by Johannes earlier on, to enable a traceable and transparent maintenance history record of a vehicle, right? So basically, whenever a vehicle is maintained in a garage, you would get a signed certificate, giving full transparency over the vehicle's history in terms of maintenance processes. So these were the two main kind of use cases that we focused on in this iteration of the standard.
Yeah.
About 15 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm going to pause here for a moment to see if there's any question in the chat box. There's a question from Lawrence about what is the roadmap for getting and tracking existing vehicles into MOBI VID? Can anyone become an oracle? How would you suggest handling conflicting VID from multiple oracles? I think we're going to talk about that. We can touch on that in the next question, which is the technical and institutional challenges. So let's do that. And I don't see any more questions here. So let's move forward. Alan, you want to talk about the latest use case that we've all been discussing?
Yeah, so as was already mentioned, right, the two sort of use cases that you'll see in the standard that we've put out are the one on maintenance records and also vehicle registration. But as we discussed more doing an implementation, right, of these standards, we started turning our attention towards something that not only can involve lots of different working groups, but also something that would be easy for our respective companies to get behind, right? And so related to the whole issue of parts tracking, right? And to some extent, supply chain management, right? One of the things we talked about was batteries, right? And when I say batteries, you know what I mean, for battery electric vehicle, right? And so this is a sort of technology that's sort of relatively new, right? The standards of goodness haven't been well established yet, right? One of the things I learned in terms of institutional challenges from working at Ford is a new sort of not well understood technology like blockchain is best applied to new use cases rather than trying to replace existing ones. So the whole challenge of tracking the life cycle of a battery, right, of being able to track its usage and to some extent be able to have some sort of metric that sort of quantifies its remaining value. The way to think about it is for an ICE vehicle, we talk about the mileage, right? And that's really the metric that people use in terms of establishing what is the usage, right? What's the remaining value left in that thing? What is the corresponding thing for a battery? And how can you standardize that? How can you make that information secure, right? So that it can't be tampered with and provable, right, for a vehicle, right? So these are all things that we saw as lending themselves, right, a use case that lent itself very well to the sort of infrastructure and ideas that we were talking about creating.
Yeah, there's a question that just came in the chat box from Edmund Bell King. I think this is a question appropriate for Johannes Siedelmeier. In terms of the VID, is that coming from a secure element or the vehicle wallet?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And in my opinion, definitely yes. So in the end, we somehow need a tight binding between the physical vehicle and its digital identity. And by having something like a vehicle birth certificate, we can certainly say that the car is supposed to be red. Maybe it has a certain VIN number and maybe it has a certain shape, length, width, whatever. But in order to establish a strong binding between the car's digital identity and the physical identity, I would need to see it. So like biometrics in my ID card. But for many use cases that are happening purely remotely, this is certainly not sufficient because I cannot see the vehicle and check whether the attributes match. And therefore, we need a strong cryptographic binding between the car and its digital identity. And I don't know of any alternative compared to secure elements. And maybe even one secure element is not enough because maybe I can remove this quite easily. So we can really look to how in other sectors this problem is solved, like for example, Apple's computers, where you actually have a lot of secure elements and they somehow play together. And in order for the full system to work, you need a certificate of the OEM that it's exactly this list of secure elements that makes it functional. And maybe for the time being, this is too ambitious because we can't assume that all the cars that are currently out there already have a secure element that can support the use cases that we need and the signature types that we need. But in the medium and long term, we certainly want to tie this to a secure element.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat box about can anyone become an oracle, and how would you suggest handling conflicting VID from the multiple oracles? You want to quickly chime in on that?
Yeah, so I try to answer it. I don't know exactly in which sense the oracles should be understood. So maybe you can briefly clarify this? Maybe also unmute yourself, because this would help me. I only know of oracles in the cryptocurrency space on how to feed in verifiable data on the blockchain, but I'm not sure whether this is meant here.
Yeah, Lawrence, you want to unmute and give us a context of your question? He just unmuted.
This doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe for the remaining question, so for getting the vehicle identity out to existing cars, I think there are two options. I mean, either we can add new hardware to these cars in order to make the vehicle identity as we want to have it work. So like adding a small CPU that can handle the tasks that we need, because it's probably very difficult to get it into the highly secure system that's already there in the car. This might be difficult. The other approach that might be good for the short and medium term is that the vehicle wallet is maybe not yet fully functional on the vehicle itself, but as a service, it's still run, for example, in the OEM's backend. Because there we don't need to care about the bandwidth that would be required maybe, and the storage capacities and also the flexibility that we might need. So we would basically already make the step into a self-maintained vehicle wallet, but yet the whole container would still run in the OEM's backend. And once the cars are ready and equipped with the necessary hardware, it would not make a lot of difficulties to just take this container and put it onto the car, and then it's fully self-sovereign, basically.
Yeah, so thanks, Johannes. We've got a bunch of questions. The way I read it, they're mostly related to implementation challenges. So let's switch to that topic. Alan, you want to talk about the institutional challenges to implement and adapt this VID from OEM perspective?
Yeah, to some extent, we've touched on that already, right? And the whole idea of the secure element and the fact that, you know, even if the automaker started now and said, okay, we're going to put this in our next generation of vehicles, it's what, like for many people, 3, 4, 5 years, right, before that would see the light of day. So, you know, that sort of illustrates some of the challenges of the automotive space, right? It's a conservative business by nature. Product cycles are long, right? The amount of capital investment is extremely high. And so all of that leads, you know, to a business that's very conservative, right? And so that's always going to be a challenge in trying to bring a, you know, a cutting edge technology into what is a very conservative business. I think what's going to be important for us all along, just like Johannes was talking about, is making sure we have backward compatibility. So yes, the ideal state would, for example, be a secure element, right? But we're going to have to answer the question of, okay, for all of those cars that don't have that, right? How are we going to make this infrastructure work, right? The other challenge for a lot of the companies is going to be just finding a use case that has, you know, business potential, right? Where people can make money off of it, right? And that's always been a challenge, right? I mean, certainly within Ford, I know a lot of times there's a lot of interest at the higher levels of the company, but the first question that they ask is, hey, this is great. How are we going to make money off of this? Right?
Yeah.
So that's always been the challenge for us, right? Is finding a use case that has real business value. But the good news is I think there is a lot of interest, and I've seen before within my own company that interest increasing, right? So when you talk about things like BEVs, right? Where there's a new business that people are still trying to figure out, to the extent that we can add value, right? And solve problems that will solve in other ways, that's how we can bring this technology into this space. But I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot of challenges. This is a conservative business.
Yeah. Johannes, Klebs, you wanna chime in? And there's a follow-up question directed to you. So let's go ahead and give us your,
so
your
maybe
2 cents.
first concerning the socioeconomic challenge, like obviously there's some challenges on the automotive side or the OEM side, right? But another challenge, and I think this is even harder because it's not under control of like a single entity or a single company, is well, the socioeconomic challenges, right? Like questions that arise are, for example, you know, what incentive structure do you have for service providers to use vehicle identity, right? You know, as Adam mentioned, what are suitable business models? Like, how can we make sure that the technology is reconciled with the regulatory frameworks such as GDPR and so on? So what I'm trying to say is that in the end, and this is an experience that we have with all of these emerging technologies, right? In the end, it's not really a technological challenge, but most of the time it's really a, you know, governance and ecosystem challenge, right? And this is, I guess, the reason why all of us are here today, and why MOBI plays such a big role in the ecosystem, is to make sure that these questions are answered, right? And to come up with incentives models that work for everybody involved.
There's a question for, sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say to that point, you know, there was a really good question asked by Jonathan Snyder that actually relates to all of this, right? And it's the problem of, you know, we talked about the maintenance tracking use cases, right? And we've talked about that in the context, let's say, of somebody being able to prove that their vehicle had, you know, maintenance from the OEM. But Jonathan Snyder asked a really good question. What about the 300,000 independent shops out there, right? How do they play in this, right? How do we get them on board? And that's not just a business question, right? In terms of money. It's also a regulatory question, right? Because somebody actually within Ford, you know, raised the whole problem to me that I believe there have been antitrust cases around this, right? In terms of OEMs making information needed to service vehicles available to these shops, right? So it's the same thing is going to happen in this world, right? That we're trying to create here, right? With this maintenance tracking. We're going to have to figure out a way to allow everybody to play in this infrastructure. And just like Johannes says, that's a governance problem, right? It's not really a technology problem.
Yeah,
Johannes, at the halfway mark.
Yeah, Johannes Klebs, you want to chime in on that question from Jonathan Snyder? Because it was directed to you, so I want to give you a moment.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, I mean, Alan pretty much answered it, right? Like, I think in terms of infrastructure that is needed, it's really nothing, right? Like, I mean, this is the beauty about SSI. Basically, as soon as you've got that open ecosystem ready, well, everybody can basically come up and sign certificates, right? The question is whether you as an entity are trusted to be, you know, to be able to sign these certificates, right? But I mean, in general, this is the whole point about this open nature of that decentralized public key infrastructure, is that everybody theoretically can join in, sign certificates, and be part of that network, right? And yeah, so the scalability of the whole thing is definitely not the problem. It's rather, again, right, that governance problem, as Adam mentioned, that I would worry about in the long run, right? Like, why would anybody want to participate, right? And why would anybody then trust in the certificate that is being signed, right? Like, and this is not a question that can be answered through blockchain necessarily. It can't be answered through a centralized system, by the way, either, right? This is more of a fundamental question of how this business should be run in the first place.
Yeah. There's a question from Raz Keshareddy. Johannes Klebs, you wanna take a stab at it? Given the democratization of MOBI as a go-to standard for vehicle affiliate identities involving onboarding more and more OEMs, do we have a roadmap for the same? It would be painstaking for any verifier of vehicle identities if there are multiple VID standards and multiple OEM consortiums. Sounds like a
Sure.
question
Yeah. I
for
mean,
Chris and Tram, but you can answer.
I was gonna say, yeah, but like I can definitely and like I mean this is the whole point about Moody, right? Like this is the reason why all of us are here. And I think like I mean this was the talks that we had like 2 years ago in the colloquium in Munich and also in LA last year, right? The whole point about MOBI is that standardization, right? And I don't think that MOBI ever wanted to create a a standard that competes with other standards, right? That's not really the point about standards.
Yeah.
And we are all in the same business in the end, right? Trying to make that blockchain ecosystem a little more transparent, more open, and more collaborative. And well, I mean, standardization is the way to go. And I don't know, the moment that anybody hears about another blockchain-based VID standard, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. But as far as I know, yeah,
nobody else is working on that, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Alan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, you know, back to the point that I said about the auto business being sort of conservative by nature for a lot of reasons. You know, obviously only Ford and BMW I think are represented here, but there are more OEMs other than that, right? In MOBI, and I know full well that there are a number of others that have sort of kicked the tires and are looking around, right? In any sort of conservative business, it tends to be that there are a lot of people who would rather sit back and watch. My expectation is, right, is that it's on us to be successful, right? In other words, it's on us to actually create an implementation, do a pilot, right, of some relevant use case, show that it works. And I'm pretty confident there are a lot of people that are sort of kicking the tires and the sort of looking will jump on board. I wouldn't expect that a competitor, you know, in terms of a competing standard would arise. But if it did, right, my recommendation to us as MOBI would be for us to try to work with them and combine into one. I definitely agree. Yeah, I definitely agree with the point that the question, the person who asked the question was making, and that is that it's not in the I think the industry's interest to have multiple standards on this.
Yeah, makes sense. So Johannes Silmar, you want to talk about some technical challenges in implementing and adapting VID by the OEMs and other stakeholders? I mean, it's mostly SSI and DID and what's going on in that space.
Sure. I mean, we already touched a few of them.
Yeah.
So as Johannes also already nicely pointed out, so often scalability and transaction speed is an issue with blockchains. In this case, it's not, because we really don't have a lot of things going on blockchain. It's, as I said, it's more of a static telephone book for institutions that sometimes needs to be updated. And even if we have revocations, typically you don't need a revocation instantaneously. So you can, for example, make a batched update every noon or every midnight. So in this case, this is not a challenge. So what are the challenges? On the one hand, it's certainly the part of the binding. So like the secure elements, which are not out there for every car so far. One other thing that's more of an implementation issue than a technical issue per se, is that we don't have these chains of trust in a lot of SSI implementations yet. So today's PKI that's based on certificate authorities has this nice hierarchy where you have a root certificate, then it signs sub-certificates, these sub-certificates again sign sub-certificates and so on. So that in the end, you don't need to remember thousands or tens of thousands of institutions that you trust, but you only have a handful, and you know that these are basically certifying other trustworthy institutions. So again, this nicely points out the governance that we have there, that still in the real world, we cannot do every trust purely cryptographically. We somehow need experienced or familiar governance mechanisms that are already there. And we have some difficulties. So right now in a lot of implementations of SSI, we really assume that somehow the signing key that creates the certificate is also known to the other parties. So we definitely need to work on this.
There's a question talking about implementation, practical challenge. There's a question from Edmund about how could this work with retrofitted vehicles, saying converting an old diesel car to electric vehicle, battery operated electric vehicle.
Yeah,
mean,
well, I'm assuming this is referring to the point we mentioned earlier about the battery certificate, right? That we were working on. And yeah, that's a good point, right? So the key thing here is we're talking about here is creating a certificate that's associated with the battery, right? And one of the use cases we were even talking about this enabling would be battery swapping, right? Because there are a lot of manufacturers that have talked about doing that, right? Sort of the idea that you would buy a car, right? And effectively, let's say, lease your battery, right? So the idea is that as batteries improved, or sometimes even when you would charge, right? Rather than actually charging up your battery, you would drive into a bay, your battery would be dropped out and a fully charged battery would be dropped in, right? But the question is in a model like that, you're going to need to be able to track the state of that battery, right? And the usage of that battery, right? In a tamper-proof way, right? Separately from any vehicle, right? So you can think of the use case that you're talking about here, right? Retrofitting any ICE vehicle, right? With a battery electric powertrain is just a variant almost, right, of the sort of battery swapping use case, right? There's going to be a battery pack that could be new or used that you want to swap into your vehicle and then associate that battery pack with your vehicle and then be able to track its usage in a secure way after that, right? So I think this could work in the same way that we would work, we plan to make that battery swapping use case work. And as to the part about Tesla not having 5-year product cycles, right? I see that in the question too, right? I was joking with somebody the other day. Look, everybody knows that Tesla's solid waste doesn't stink, right? So let's start with that. And I don't know what their product cycles, how long their product cycles are, but let's at least agree that I think for everybody in this business, it's measured in years, right? And just that fact alone, create some difficulties, right, when it comes to trying to bring in new technology. That was really the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, Johannes Kleps, you want to chime in?
I think Adam said it well, right? Like I think the challenge really here is in the short run to create these working prototypes that don't rely necessarily on trusted enclaves and trusted modules within the car. And yeah, Johannes Ziedelmeier already made the point about basically moving that module basically to the cloud that is then managed by the OEM for some time, and then eventually when the hardware is ready, migrate that to the car and physically bind it to the car. But one other point that I wanted to make here is that basically this is really like a OEM specific implementation detail, right? Like how you basically do that binding. And it's not something that necessarily has to be standardized through MOBI, right? Like the point of view that I'm coming from is that MOBI basically comes up with a implementation criteria, requirements, standardization, but the physical and the official implementation should then remain in the hands of basically the implementation partners, right? Both on the OEM side, but also on the application side, right? And this is why we would never, come up with a concrete requirement with respect to the technology partner that we want to interact with, right? But we want to focus on that standard level, talking about W3C, talking about, process flows, but never, highlighting a specific partner that we would want to do it with.
A question just came in. Is VID contemplating vehicles other than passenger cars? How broadly applicable across vehicle types is the standard hope to be? Who wants to take that? Alan?
So to some extent, I can't completely answer the question, right? Because obviously I'm not involved with everything that MOBI gets into and who they've talked to. But, right, with that said, what we're doing here, I could definitely see being applicable to aircraft, right? I think a lot of the challenges are very similar. And to, let's say, something like trains, right? And then even to other types of, road vehicles like buses and trucks or what have you, right? In other words, I don't think what we're talking about here is is necessarily, you know, automotive specific. I certainly agree with that point. If that's
Yeah,
what was being
the way the standards have been drafted, it doesn't necessarily have to stick with the passenger cars. It can apply to other modes as well.
Yes.
So we have about 12 minutes left, and we don't have more questions here. So I wanted to talk about the vehicle identity working group. You know, what are we working on now? What's in the future? Where's the focus going to be? I know you guys touch on that a little bit, but let's give some more detail on that. Johannes Kleps, you want to take a stab first?
Sure, yeah. So basically, I was briefly going through the process that we went through over the last, year or so. And basically, so what we did now is that we suggested a reference architecture, right, for process flows for certain use cases. And yeah, obviously, we hope that these, standardized process flows are used in practice. And not only incentivized by us, but that people somehow find it useful and get inspired, building use cases along these lines. So I think internally the standard is undergoing a review period by the MOBI community, right? So we will integrate like feedback that we get by the community and see what the community comes back with. And in terms of next steps, I mean, there are endless possibilities with respect to vehicle identity. We realized that when brainstorming about potential use cases for VID and in the very early days of the working group, right? So I guess one alternative would be to just like look at other process flows for other use cases other than vehicle registration or maintenance traceability. But I think what's even more relevant than that is to, really strive for applications of the process flows that are already out there, because only by applying something, you realize, whether it works or not, right? So, and this is basically what Alan was mentioning a couple of minutes ago, is that we're looking in, creating small MVPs that base upon the process flows and standardized documents that we now created, right? And I think this is really where we'll see whether it works, right? And this is also where we'll be able to, test the boundaries of the governance frameworks and to test out different incentivization models. And this is where the fun stuff starts.
Exactly. Alan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? That ultimately, we spent, some time understanding the space, creating standards, right? It's been interesting to watch the technology itself evolve, right? From where we started, right? All of this started at in like 2018, right? So the technology and the thinking, right, in the DLT space has really changed as MOBI has come about. But I think, to the point that Johannes was making, I think the most important thing for us to do going forward in the near term is actually to implement some of these concepts, right? To create an MVP, right? To have something that's multi OEM, right? At least two, but preferably more, right? And show that this is real. And I think that's important not just within our individual companies in terms of building support, right, within what are, as I mentioned, very conservative organizations, but also getting others involved, right, to that point of it's on us to be successful. And I think that will get some of the fence sitters off of that fence. I think to the extent that we can create something real and show that this can actually work and work at scale, I think will bring more people on board also.
Yeah, thanks. So there are 3 questions in the chat box. I'll take one. There's a question from Anjana about does MOBI have a sandbox environment for developers to try it out? There is a sandbox being developed. What we call it an open mobility network project. So look out for that in the website. It should be out in the near future. There are other 2 questions. This is a more technical question. I think Johannes Siedelmeier is appropriately suited for that. So the one is from Stephen Patton. Is MOBI familiar with the Trust over IP org? They're building the standards and protocols around ecosystems of DID. And then the second question is from Edmund. Is there any work to link the vehicle secure element to other unique identifiers in the vehicle?
Sure. So maybe I start with the secure element question.
Sure. Sure.
So, I mean, this might depend on the kind of secure element that we choose. I mean, on the one hand, we can typically create multiple keys in the secure element, and this might also be very useful if privacy requirements are high, because if I only use one key from the secure element and I always use this to prove the binding, then this key will be recognizable and basically traceable, which is always easier in the digital world than in the analog world. On the other hand, what one can, of course, do is issue certificates that connect keys with each other. So, for example, there is one key of the secure element referenced in the vehicle birth certificate. And maybe then I have the OEM sign another credential that says, okay, so this vehicle birth certificate also belongs to the following two other keys. So I can again use binding through issuing new credentials. And there are also cool cryptographic techniques to make somehow for the car being able to prove that certain keys belong together, but on the other hand, it's not correlatable for an outsider that I don't want to see it. And if you are familiar with the Trust over IP Foundation, maybe you also know the implementation, for example, of Sovereign's ANAN creds. This goes into this direction. So there we have a so-called link secret, which can be used to bind different credentials to each other without revealing too much information about the binding itself. And so, yes, we are we are observing what Trust over IP, Sovereign, and all other great people and organizations in the SSI space are doing, and we're definitely also orienting the standard that we write. So basically all the terminology should fit quite well to what Trust over IP, Sovereign, and others are doing. We decided to make it slightly more open. So basically we don't want to lock in onto a particular implementation. We want to keep some degrees of freedom, like, for example, a verifiable credential could also be implemented by referencing to a hash on a blockchain, and where the respective transaction has been signed by the issuer. I personally regard what Trust over IP and others are doing very, very, probably the best implementation of SSI that I'm aware of. And so I really also hope that in the future we will stick to the standards that are created there.
Yeah, thanks. So we have about 4 minutes left. I don't see any more. Well, there's one question that just popped up. Is DLT open source or going to be open source? Not sure what that means. Is Lawrence, are you asking if the VID standards are going to be open sourced? If that's the question, then the short answer is yes.
If it's about the blockchain, so we don't have a particular blockchain for
the blockchain you're implementing
VID
it
standard.
on. Yeah.
So this is supposed to be blockchain agnostic, and I think in any case there will be multiple ledgers in the future that play a role in SSI, because actually I have several telephone books at home. I don't know whether you have, but this works quite well. So if you know where to look up things, you don't need to care too much about cross-chain communication and all these difficult stuff when you want to have different cryptocurrencies, for example, to be able to talk to each other. This is way less complex in the way that we use blockchain for a DPKI.
Yeah, so just to add to that, MOBI has another initiative called Open Mobility Network. I briefly mentioned that. So there's some implementation prototyping happening, and please check out our website for that. Also, Johannes Siedelmar mentioned glossary of terms compatible with other standards and prevalent definitions. MOBI just put out a glossary of terms in its website. There's about, I don't know, 60 or 70 terms that some of it we borrow from other standards and other references. So that's a good place to look for. Let's see if there's any more question. Okay, Annabelle is saying that there is a talk on Trust over IP on our website. I guess it's a past event. So all those events are in MOBI's web. The past events are in MOBI's website. Just in closing, thank you all for participating. Thank you, panel members, for coming in, and all the participants. Please visit mobi.dlt for more information about what MOBI is working on, about the standards development, reference architecture, open mobility network, and most importantly, bringing the industry together for the new economy movement. If you have more questions, feel free to email. I think it's info@mobi.dlt. Annabelle, is that correct? Or you can find one of us or all four of us in LinkedIn. I think we're all there. So thank you again, and have a great rest of the week.
Bye.
Bye.